Okay, in this chapter, in section 1 of chapter 2, we are going to look at the roots of American democracy. So you'll have this notes page in your Google Classroom. So make sure that you pause and type in everything that I have in red as you go through and do your notes. So we're going to begin looking at which American ideas derive from an English political heritage. In other words, most of the colonists that founded America, founded the United States, were of English descent. So what ideas, political ideas, did they get from their English ancestry? Well, there were three of them, particularly, probably more than that, but these three in specific: representative government, limited government, and individual rights. So let's talk about each one of those. Representative government, that's the idea that the government should represent uh, the people. Okay. And in England, the representative government traditions date back to the 11th century. Back then, a king's council was formed that was called Parliament. And basically, this was meant to give the king some advice and help from the people um, that he represented, that he governed. And basically, these were only nobles. These would not have been any common people. These would have been the landowners, the lords. That council was called Parliament. Now, eventually, Parliament became bicameral. That was over a period of hundreds of years. Bicameral means that it had two houses of representation. The upper house was called the House of Lords, which is where the lords had their representation. And then the lower house was the House of Commons, where villages and towns and others had their representation. But this idea dates back to the 11th century. We also have the idea of limited government. In 1215, the Magna Carta, which is a document you have probably heard of, was signed by King John. This document granted certain rights to nobles. Now, let's talk about King John for just a moment. If you've ever had anything to do with or watched any of the Robin Hood movies, you've heard them talk about King John. They hated King John. He was levying all the taxes. That's why Robin Hood came about. He was not popular. He was not well liked in his own time, and that's where the Robin Hood stories come from. Okay, so King John loved to go to war with France, and he fought constantly with them, but he was terrible. Okay, they lost. In fact, his nickname was King John the Soft Sword because he was so bad at it. But he, in order to fight those wars, had to raise taxes a lot, and so people did not like that. So eventually, the nobles got tired of being taxed. They got tired of losing, and so they basically cornered King John and forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Now he didn't follow it really. After this, he kind of rebelled against it, but the idea stuck. Okay, there were things in it like no taxation without representation, trial by jury, those kind of things that have become a part of our American heritage and American life. That was started then. Basically, this was the first time in history that the king's power was limited, and so that was a very significant event. But it put in mind of the people the idea that the king should be limited, that government should be limited, and there should be certain rights that people are granted, and that the king should protect those. The next thing is this idea of individual rights, and this came out of that idea of the Magna Carta. And as they began to apply these things in the Magna Carta that specifically applied to the nobles, those eventually were going to be applied to all citizens, since that was a period of hundreds of years that this took place. The first one was 1628 when the Petition of Right was signed by King Charles I. They had to have Parliament's approval to raise taxes, no unlawful imprisonment, no quartering of soldiers. Quartering of soldiers is when the king would force you to house soldiers and feed them and all of that in your home, especially during peacetime. No military rule in times of peace. So these were going to be applied to all people, or to more people. And then you get to 1689 and you get the English Bill of Rights signed by King Charles II, and it extended these rights to all people. So these were being taking place um, over periods of time. Now, notice 1628, 1689, the American colonies were being founded by this time, most of them. And so a lot of the founders of the colonies lived through these things. And so this became a embedded part of American ideas, thought. Okay. And so those things were gained from our English political heritage. Now, let's talk about number two. How did colonial governments give English colonists experience in self rule? Now, I want you to remember the colonies were not close to England, and there was not a fast way to communicate. If you wanted to send a message to the king and get a response, you would have to write it down, find a boat that would be leaving to go to England, put it there, hope that over the 3 or so months of time it would take to cross the Atlantic by wind power, that it didn't sink or get attacked by a Spanish or French pirate or anything like that. And eventually it might reach the king. Maybe. Who knows? The person you sent it with might not ever get to the king. He might die from Black Plague or something. Who knows? So maybe in 3 months or 6 months or however long, the king might see your message. If the king wanted to read it, he might not. And then the king would then have to deliberate, make his decision, write it down, and send it back across, and you still have the same perils that it could face. So you're talking a year at least on a fast turnaround. Years if it's not a fast turnaround. And so the colonists didn't have time to wait for the king to instruct them. The king couldn't wait for him to get news about what was going on and make a timely decision. So the colonists just basically had to do things on their own. So there were 3 types of colonies that were founded, and each of those types of colonies gave the colonists some measure of self-rule. So you had proprietary and charter colonies, which were largely self-governing. They basically just operated without the king. And then you had royal colonies who technically were the king's colonies, but there was still a certain measure of self-rule because they had a lower house of colonial representatives. We'll talk about those in just a moment. Now, some of the early experiments in early governance in the American colonies were in 1619, which was 400 years ago. We just celebrated this anniversary just a little over a year ago. The Virginia or Jamestown House of Burgesses was established. It really was Jamestown, but that was a Virginia colony. Burgesses would be representatives. Okay, and basically this was the first time that in the colonies that there was a representative body. Now remember, Jamestown was a proprietary colony. We'll talk about that again, but that was the first time that we had representative government in the American colonies. And then in 1620, as the Pilgrims were on the way over on the Mayflower, they signed a compact. It established a type of democracy for the colony, majority rule, that kind of things. So even the Puritans and the Pilgrims, as they were coming over, were establishing a type of self-rule before they even got here. In 1639, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was passed, which said that free men could select their own judges, and there were other things in it as well. But those are some of the early experiments in the colonies on self-government. Okay, now the types of English colonies that we look at are proprietary colony. This was a grant given by the king to a company to found a colony. And now remember, technically the king owned all the land. So you couldn't just go over here and claim your own land. The king had to give you a grant for that. And so, like Jamestown, for instance, was founded as a proprietary colony because they were coming, hopefully, to find gold. Now, eventually, it turned into tobacco, but they were coming to find gold. But they convinced the king to give them that grant of land so they could come and establish a colony and make a profit. Well, that was good for the king because, number one, he didn't have to worry about governing them so much. He didn't have to pay for the startup cost. He didn't have to pay for the transportation. He didn't have to pay for any of that. The company did that. Okay, and so these had a large measure of self-rule. Usually the company would appoint a governor or somebody like that to kind of guide or rule over them. But they, as we've seen with the Jamestown colony in 1619, established their own representative government to kind of guide a lot of things that the company didn't really care about. Okay. Then you had royal colonies, which were established by the king and technically ruled over by the king. He would appoint a governor, but even in the royal colonies, they would elect a representative body to advise and help the governor. And they had certain measure of freedoms as well, depending on which colony you were in. And then you had charter colonies. These were the most self-governing colonies. They were individuals or groups allowed to go and start their own colony. Pennsylvania was an example of that. William Penn was a Quaker, and he wanted a place where Quakers could go and have freedom. Okay, so he convinced the king. He was a lord, but he convinced the king to grant him a colony, and they called it Pennsylvania, which means Penn's Woods, and it was meant as a haven for the Quakers. Rhode Island was a charter colony as well. There were people like Anne Hutchinson and others who were religiously persecuted in the Boston and Salem communities and those in the Massachusetts area because they were not Puritans. They were Quakers or Baptists or whatever the case may be. So they left and went to Rhode Island and founded their own colony and got permission from the king to do so. And they were the first colony that actually truly allowed religious freedom. But they had the most self-government. Now, as we move forward, we're going to talk about the intellectual influences that shaped the development of political philosophy, American political philosophy, because we had all this heritage that we'd experienced. We had all these things they had done in the colonies once we got here. But by the time our founders came along, they were also philosophers. They did a lot of deep thinking and study and stuff. Um, there were classical sources such as the Greeks and the Romans from ancient times. Um, the Greeks, for instance, they studied specifically Athens, which was a democracy, a true democracy. The Romans were a republic. They learned a lot about government from the Greeks and the Romans of ancient times. They also had a lot of Judeo Christian beliefs and the Enlightenment thinkers from France and England. So let's talk about each one of those individually. Republicanism values citizen participation, the public good. In other words, people should consider how our actions affect others, and civic virtue. In other words, that we would seek the good of the whole community rather than ourselves. So those were things that republicanism valued. It's also the idea that the people should elect representatives, but value minority rights. Um, our founders hated the idea of democracy. Democracy was a bad word to them, so they shunned that word and didn't like it. Every democracy they had studied did not last, and it was because it just does not work over long periods of time, and there are no protections for those who lose the election. And so they wanted a republic, one where the people would have a say in who represents them, but their rights would be protected even if they lost the election. And it would also give the minority some say in what laws were passed, so that it wouldn't just be the majority running over the minority. Okay, so that's republicanism. That's one of the ideas that they got from the Romans, particularly, as well as from some of the Enlightenment thinkers. There were Judeo-Christian influences. There's debate today as to whether or not our country was founded on Christian principles, and that could be debated, but there is no doubt that the influences of Judaism and Christianity came up and showed themselves in the founding of our country. That's the idea that law and individual rights were given by God. Other traditions believed that came from the king. Okay, but this idea that these things come from God, or that they're just because we're human beings, we have these rights and things like that. That comes from Judeo-Christian influences. It's also the idea of individual responsibility before God and government. The Protestant Reformation happened in the 1500s, and almost all Americans, colonists, were Protestants, and so they had this idea that I'm responsible before God. The church doesn't get me to heaven. I have a relationship with God. That's what, it's between me and God, not between me and some other body. So it gave them a lot of individualism as well. And that came from that Protestant Reformation. And lastly, there were several Enlightenment thinkers that they looked at, people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who wrote a lot about government. We've talked some about that. Thomas Hobbes wrote the Leviathan. John Locke wrote the treatises on government. So they got a lot of their ideas from them and other Enlightenment thinkers. Adam Smith wrote about capitalism. We talked about him last semester in economics. William Blackstone was a legal scholar in England in the 1700s, and he wrote a lot about common law and what it meant and the definitions and all of that. And so our founders used his ideas in writing the Constitution and defining terms and things like that. All right, make sure you type all this stuff in and submit it for a grade. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day.